Hello, and welcome to this presentation on the papal encyclical Laudato Si. Laudato Si is celebrating its 5th anniversary, and it is considered by Pope Francis himself his most important contribution to human society today, and the one that holds a very high priority for himself and his papal ministry. Laudato Si represents a response by the Catholic Church to the growing realities, the growing challenge of the damage to our ecology and to all of creation. It lays out the problem. It says what new viewpoints within Catholicism may be necessary in order to address this issue from a Catholic perspective, and it summarizes where we have come in responding to the challenge, but also importantly, where we still have to go. 5 years ago, when Laudato Si came on the scene, it received great praise from many outside the Catholic community, from many in the scientific world, and so on. Many in the scientific world who had spoken about the challenge of ecological destruction that was taking over our planet were very grateful to Pope Francis for bringing this to a wider audience and to founding a response to the crisis, not merely in scientific terms, but precisely in religious terms. Pope Francis was following up on initial efforts along this line. Very early on at the Second Vatican Council, there wasn't too much said about it there. But then Pope John Paul II and his successor, Pope Benedict XVI, both contributed to the new interest in responding to the ecological challenge. Both Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict were also influenced by the ecumenical patriarch Bartholomew of Constantinople, or as we would call it today, Istanbul. The ecumenical patriarch was a real leader in pushing, if you want, the concern about ecology into the Catholic community. So the Catholic response to the ecological challenge has always been ecumenical and increasingly interreligious. It's no accident that the annual celebration of Laudato Si here in the Archdiocese of Chicago has usually taken place at one of the Orthodox Christian churches in order to emphasize the collaboration that is necessary among the Christian communities and beyond the Christian communities with the other faith traditions that inhabit this city and a good part of the world. Now, in terms of Catholicism, the encyclical emphasizes a number of key points. First of all, it does clearly support the notion that our planet is in serious danger ecologically. It could come to a point where living on this planet is no longer sustainable. And that is the direction we're taking because of and it involves a number of factors, the melting of the ice caps and the resultant rise in ocean levels, which could literally bury some 70 countries into the sea. I myself know people whose ancestral homelands are now underwater. They will never be able to return. I know that in places like Micronesia and elsewhere where I've had some contact. I've also seen, for example, a BBC program on one of the islands in the South Sea where when they interviewed the younger people under 30, to a person, the response was, we don't expect to die here. We will have to leave this island because it is sinking into the sea. There's already a commission in place in the southern part of Florida, which is doing very advanced planning about the need to relocate thousands of people from South Florida and the Florida Keys to the central part of the state, because the fear is that cities like Miami, Miami Beach, Key West, Marathon, and will simply fall below the waterline eventually. Even today, if you talk to someone who owns property in that area, they will tell you immediately that insurance prices on property are either totally unavailable or simply have skyrocketed to almost a cost that is not sustainable. So these are some of the realities that we face. And we have to acknowledge this and offer some response as to how we not only envision this, but how we deal with it in the coming decades. Scientists have told us that we may have 10, maybe 20 years to address seriously these issues if we hope to turn around the destruction of the planet and conserve its sustainability, not only for the human community, but for the entire web of creation. The second point, and I use this term web of creation, it's used by many people, to really emphasize a second point made in Laudato Si, namely that we are indeed intertwined as human people with all of creation. This is not totally new. You can find traces of this kind of understanding in the biblical tradition, in the stories of creation, and so on. You can find it even in the prayer of the Our Father, one of the most probably best known prayers in the Christian tradition, which honors God as creator of everything. We also know that the Bible emphasizes the goodness of creation. Far too often, I think, we have stressed the evil side of creation and the fall and so on, and giving a kind of negative view to this world. At times throughout the history of Christianity, we have developed a mindset which I think has been particularly destructive, because first of all, we tend to see our time in this world as being in exile, that we are in exile from our true home, which is heaven. Now, no one's going to question Catholic belief in an afterlife and in a life hereafter, but this kind of belief cannot then turn us into people who regard our time on the earth as simply it being in exile. Because if we conceive of ourselves as being in exile here, we want to get rid of that exilic status as soon as possible. And certainly, it's not going to encourage us to really assume the kind of human responsibility that we need to reverse the damaging effects of the ecological crisis. So we have to really examine some of our prayer traditions, which emphasize that we are only in exile here, and really emphasize a prayer tradition that puts us squarely on the earth as our home for at least the foreseeable future as humanity, and with the responsibility to protect that home for future generations. This brings me to point 3 of the Laudato Si. Point 3 is that we now face a new level of human responsibility, something that we probably never imagined before. This first dawned upon me back in the early 1970s. I had the opportunity to attend an international conference in Los Angeles I believe in 1972. And the keynote speech at that conference was given by a Jewish scholar who escaped the Nazis and relocated to the New School of Social Research in New York. His name was Hans Jonas. And in his address, which was called The Imperative of Human Responsibility and was later published as a book by that title by the University of Chicago Press, Jonas challenged the audience to think in a quite different way about our role in the preservation of the globe. He said, we are the first generation to have to ask the question, will there be future generations? In the past, whatever we did to nature, nature seemed to have the recuperative inner powers to come back. But now we may be able to do permanent damage to our ecology in a way that will really make the sustaining of human life and all creational life problematical. I think we also have to recognize that if we have a kind of fundamentally destructive understanding of the future of the world by misinterpreting what we call in the book of Revelation, or what we used to call the book of the Apocalypse, which many people interpreted as prophesying the cataclysmic destruction of everything we call the world or the globe. Today, scripture scholars tell us that is a very, very improper interpretation of that book of Revelation. Now, that kind of interpretation, though, has had a very popular presence among many people. A book based on it, called The Last Great Planet Earth, sold over 6 million copies at supermarkets and so on, and I think influenced people's mindset. Now, scripture scholars today say that the author or authors of that book didn't know anything more about the end of the world than we know. What they did hope for, and what they expressed in what is sometimes called veiled prophetic language, they hoped for the destruction of the cruel Roman Empire that dominated their time, their history. And it was a call for the destruction of the Roman Empire. It was not a validation of an apocalyptic end to the world. None of us know how the world is going to end, or even what saying it's going to end entails. But we do know, I think, more and more, and including from Scripture, that we have a responsibility to protect and enhance it as long as it is around. So that challenge is there as well in Laudato Si. Another challenge presented in Laudato Si is the notion of what is called, what the Pope called ecological sin. We generally don't think of sinfulness in terms of planetary destruction. That could be in a very minor way, by just throwing trash onto the highway, or dumping trash in a forest and so on. But we have seen ecological destruction, certainly of our water supplies, our rivers. Just think a few years ago, the famous incident when the Cuyahoga River started on fire in downtown Cleveland. But even our own Chicago River here, how polluted it got. And thank goodness that the Mayor Daley at one point established the goal that the Chicago River should be able to be used again, even for swimming and so on. We're not quite there, but we've certainly come a long way in seeing the necessity of cleaning up our water supply. We also have recognized how critical water is to human sustainability and creational sustainability. Everything depends on water, and the preservation of our water supplies and the sharing of our water supplies. And there has been some writing recently, some books coming out talking about just water, but also saying that the conflict over water supplies may trigger the next major world conflict, because, again, water is so precious to the preservation of life at all levels. So these are some, and finally, Laudato Si calls for a new spirituality, a spirituality in which the linkage between among all creatures and all creation is explicitly affirmed as not only a reality, but a good reality, that we are part of a planetary whole, of a creation that impacts each other. We haven't thought much about that. We tend to, what do we call many of our insects? We call them pests. Well, if a scorpion is trying to sting me, or a bee is trying to sting me, I probably will defend myself. But we also need to know what kind of role they play in the overall web of creation. We've seen a lot of writing in recent years about the declining presence of bees. And now we say, well, that's too bad. But it is too bad even for human existence, because we know that bees are absolutely essential to the pollination of our food supply, and the food supply for animals and so on. And so that is just one small example of the interconnectedness that is the reality of the overall creation. And that somehow that notion has to be translated into our understanding of spirituality. So those are some of the, if you want, the teachings embedded in Laudato Si. Now the question is, how far have we come? Well, I think Laudato Si has brought the attention not only of the Catholic community, but to the world community of the dangers of ignoring the ecological challenge. In some ways, I think it's very similar to the effect that Pope John the 23rd's encyclical Pacem in Terris had. Pacem in Terris, which was sort of Pope John the 23rd's final farewell message, because he was already diagnosed with terminal cancer. He, for example, included in his encyclical the famous Charter of Human Rights. That was new to Catholic thinking, and certainly led directly to the passage of the document on religious liberty and religious freedom at Vatican II, a document which really transformed Catholic thinking in a very important way, because it said that human dignity and human rights, including the right to freedom of worship, were integral to the birthright of every person. Now, in the past, not all that long before, Pope Pius IX, in his famous or infamous Syllabus of Errors, proclaimed the idea of religious freedom a satanic idea. So there was a profound change in that regard that really brought human dignity to the forefront as a birthright of all people. Not something that they earned because they believed the correct way, that they had the correct theological outlook, but because they were human, and so on. And that dignity, I think, now in Laudato Si has been extended to all of creation as well. More and more, we're seeing, as a result of this COVID-19 pandemic, a realization that of this integration of the life of the animal world and the life of the human community. I think Dr. Fauci is quite correct, and most would agree with him, that indeed these kinds of viruses, including COVID-19, have spread from animals to the human community. Now, why is that happening? A number of scientists have clearly said that we're encroaching very much on the space for animals. We're getting much closer to them, but also taking away their space. And so the transmission of these viruses is going to probably occur more and more unless we create much more space for the rest of creation. I remember I was serving actually one of my terms on the United States Holocaust Memorial Council. In that capacity, I met our Secretary of the Interior at that time, James Watt. And James Watt's theory was, well, there was no need to protect our natural parks, our wilderness areas, and so on, because Jesus was coming soon and it was all going to be destroyed anyway, and it should be destroyed because this was the only way Jesus Christ was going to come again. Now that's when religion becomes a source of social conflict, of injustice, and so on. And so it's important that we recognize that religion has been somewhat of a downside, has had a downside in terms of this, and that's why the Pope Francis's elevation of ecological destruction to the category of sinfulness, I think, is very important. Sin is the term that in Catholicism, but other parts of Christianity and even in other religious traditions, the strongest way of affirming the immorality of certain actions, if we call them a sin. For the Catholic community, there's something that then should be confessed in the sacrament of penance, and we need to make reconciliation, and we need to make amends for this sinfulness. But we haven't really thought that much about applying actions that damage the atmosphere, the biosphere, as sinful. And so I think that is now a new awareness that all of us will have to take into account, that even whether it's our small actions of simply using materials for cups and so on that are not that do not easily biodegrade, or whether it's in a much larger context, a company polluting the river or so on. But whatever it is, that is really to be seen now much more as a result of Laudato Si as something we call sinful and something that cries out for penance and reconciliation. So that is, I think, one of the places we have come, in a way, in the new spirituality, which does recognize the presence of ecological sin and the need to overcome what we have done, what our ancestors have done to destroy that ecology. We also have, I think, a much heightened sense of human responsibility. I think recalling Hans Jonas's emphasis on human responsibility and how much it has intensified in recent years, recent decades, something that moved me and transformed my own thinking in this area. I think we have to recognize that we bear singular responsibility for the future viability of all creation. Actually, Pope John Paul II recognized this in his encyclical on human work, where he called the human community co-creators with God in the management of the universe. That's a strong term, co-creator. Some have criticized, at the time, some people criticized John Paul for using the term, saying that it was a kind of like Nazi-like deification of humanity. Well, I think John Paul certainly knew the Nazi era personally and poignantly, and therefore was not espousing any Nazi-like view of human power. But he was emphasizing, I think, a new understanding of human responsibility. Yes, God continues to be creator. God continues to sustain us in the work of sustaining creation. But God will not do it alone. It's in our hands both to overcome what previous generations have done, but also to move us ahead in creating a planet that can sustain life at all levels. So our responsibility is really upgraded considerably, and I think we have to realize that, and all of us will respond to that increase in responsibility in different ways. Some of us in simple ways of continuing to recycle, to take those kinds of actions that do help us. But all of us then have to engage in some other activities as well. The two biggest challenges in many ways to the current ecological in the current ecological era are the rise in the temperature of the earth, the temperature of the air, whatever you want, and the water, and the use of fossil fuels that sustain that kind of growth, and the reality of plastics in the oceans. On the question of the rising heat level in the oceans and even in the air, we've seen the very destructive fires in Australia and California, which many predict will just become a rather common phenomenon now. They used to speak of the forest fire season in California and in Australia. Now they're saying every season is potentially a fire season because of the climate change. We're recognizing that despite the call for at the Paris climate meetings for reduction of the rising heat level of the Earth to no more than 1.5% or even 2%, we're really at this point closer to a 4% rise, and this is simply going to melt the ice caps in Antarctica. Antarctica is already experiencing its warmest weather that it's ever had, and if that again continues, we will have an overabundance of water on the planet that simply will cover over large swaths of, certainly as I already said, some 70 island countries and so on. So those are, and the plastics, scientists have shown how much plastics have contaminated our oceans, and our oceans still are very important to the ultimate food chain. Overall, I think we have to recognize that responding to climate change is going to involve some changes, maybe even major changes, to our dietary patterns, to our patterns of transportation, and so on. This is not going to be easy. This is going to require a major adjustment. Now, we've kind of become accustomed a bit to what major adjustments involve during this COVID crisis, of how quickly we've been asked to alter our ordinary lifestyle in a matter of weeks, really, matter of months, and who knows how long this change will continue. Now, in closing my presentation, let me just talk a little bit about where we need to go. Obviously, we need to continue to address these primary issues of temperature rise and the pollution of the oceans and other waterways. Pope Francis now, in celebration of the upcoming 5th anniversary of Laudato Si, has established a papal commission for the relationship between the COVID-19 pandemic and climate change. That commission, which is now at work and on which I happen to serve, is working through some 18 small groups around the world that will be submitting information to the Vatican on a weekly basis on this question of climate change and COVID-19. Pope Francis really believes that the Church should contribute some perspectives, important perspectives, to what will be the post-COVID understanding of human society. He remains convinced that there will be major changes required, and we should offer some insights from the Catholic and religious traditions to that end. He also feels, in light of his commitment to interreligious dialogue, that this effort will have to be done not simply by Catholics working in isolation, but Catholics working in collaboration with other religious traditions, both Christian and non-Christian. We're now recognizing more and more that many Christian traditions and many non-Christian traditions have a lot to contribute to insights about the interrelationship between the human community and the rest of creation. Certainly that's true of what we call the Native American tradition in this country, or more globally, the indigenous community that's increasingly recognized, and I think not Pope John Paul, but also especially Pope Francis have recognized those contributions. So we're really trying to work in an interreligious context, and the particular work group on which I'm involved is specifically addressing the question of interreligious collaboration in terms of responding to the climate change. Pope Francis really believes we need to move to a global economy that is a green economy. Now, he's not giving blanket endorsement to the discussions about a green economy that have surfaced in American political discussions in recent months in the primary campaign and so on. But he is giving approval to move in that direction in a generic way, that we will have to, as a result of what we have seen in the context of the COVID crisis, significantly alter some of our social patterns and our economic patterns. Now, it is amazing how language has changed. We now call people emergency workers, people whom a few months ago we certainly didn't know any names and we didn't care much about. A classic example, I think, a prime example is the people in the meatpacking plants who even apart from the danger of the COVID crisis, work in conditions that are really problematical to the human body. And really the kind of people who work in those jobs are people who are most vulnerable. And we've seen the statistics that the COVID crisis in this country has affected the minorities far more than it's affected the majority population. African Americans, Latinos, and Native Americans have been affected in a very significant and disproportionate way, including in terms of the number of deaths. And why is that? That certainly is in part because many people who are in those communities have very poor dietary, I won't say habits because it's not necessarily their fault, but poor dietary options, which affects their immune systems, who have limited or perhaps even no access to medical coverage and so on. So when a virus hits, they are also the most vulnerable. And so what the Pope is saying is that COVID has really shown us the fact that the relationship between health and so on and the ecological challenge is really present. Actually, that is also a theme in the Encyclical and in the resultant Vatican office that was created in significant ways to implement the Encyclical. Pope Francis sort of took several previous offices in the Vaticans, which are technically called dicasteries, and created a kind of super dicastery called the Dicastery for the Promotion of Integral Human Development. Now, that integral word is very, very critical because it means that he has a vision in which ecology cannot be seen just in isolation, but it has to be seen in relationship to economic structures and political structures in human society. They all impact on each other, and they have to be addressed together. And it is his feeling that the COVID crisis exposes in a very, very evident way many of the defects in those social economic structures that also impact and are related to climate change. So, my friends, we have a great challenge as Catholic Christians to become, to move the ecological challenge to the center of our faith thinking, to the center of our identity as Catholic Christians. We need to create a spirituality that really highlights the relationship between the human community and the rest of creation, that emphasizes the beauty of human creation. Unfortunately, as a result of the liturgical changes that occurred in Vatican II, what little we had in our previous liturgies on this theme were pretty much eliminated because they were seen as basically related to an agricultural setting for the church, which of course is no longer the majority setting for the church. The church has largely become far more urban, and the blessing of fields on certain seasons of the year didn't seem to make that much sense anymore. So when Pope Paul VI redid the kind of Catholic Missal in the light of Vatican II, those celebrations were eliminated, but they were not replaced with anything. And I think more and more we have to find ways of really enhancing this theme in our ordinary celebration of the Eucharist whenever we go back to it, so that people really see the connection and that the care for creation becomes a central part of our worship tradition, of our personal prayer tradition, of our communal prayer tradition. It will take work on the part of official liturgy commissions to redo the liturgy itself, but in the meantime, I think in parishes and schools and so on, there are ways of making clear, even within the present liturgical text, this commitment to the care of creation that is before us. It's a big challenge. It's a challenge that we must all pursue. If you wish to see more about this or understand more about this, let me say that I myself have co-authored a book called The Ecological Challenge, Ethical, Liturgical, and Spiritual Responses, which covers some of the material that I presented here. It predates Laudato Si, but not totally the coming to awareness of the ecological challenge within the Catholic community. Something much more recent that relates directly to Laudato Si is this short volume by one of the authors of Laudato Si called The 10 Green Commandments of Laudato Si, and its author is Father Jostrom Isaac Kuritadam. He is a priest of the Syro-Malabar Rite from India, and a person with scientific background who is the principal advisor to Cardinal Turkson, who heads the dicastery on integral human development, and therefore also for Pope Francis in terms of Laudato Si, but also now kind of coordinating this second response, or this response to Laudato Si for the 5th anniversary, which the Pope is promoting. Because this new commission, it will be working for several weeks. The releases that we are writing will be made present to particularly ambassadors, bishops, but also to the entire global community on a weekly basis, and then eventually they'll be collated into a much more substantive, longer document that follows up on the vision of Laudato Si. So thank you again for viewing this video, and for most of all, thank you again for, in your own lives, beginning to make the ecological challenge a central focus of your own response as a Catholic Christian.